The history of the viola is the story of an instrument that was once considered lowly, unusable, and only played by servants and bad violinists. This is the story of how the neglected and forgotten viola that was known by composers and the musical elite became elevated to an instrument that is loved, essential to all string literature and orchestra culture, and even became a powerful solo instrument alongside of the other members of its string family. It starts with early violins, violas, and other long-forgotten relatives, and the secret that all Western bowed stringed instruments are really violas. According to the Vienna Philharmonic Library, quote, "The history of the viola is closely linked to the development of other instruments in the violin family, which were first made in northern Italy between 1530 and 1550. It may be assumed that the alto, tenor, and bass versions emerged soon after the soprano instrument. Illustrious names, such as Andrea and Nicola Amati, Gasparo de Saio, Andrea Guarneri, and Antonio Stradivari, were already associated with cities such as Milan, Brescia, Cremona, and Venice at this time. The names of all stringed instruments are derived from the term viola. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it described two families of string instruments: the viola da braccio and the viola da gamba. Da braccio is Italian for played on the arm and refers to the horizontal playing position. Da gamba means played at the leg and refers to the vertical playing position. To understand the role of the early viola, we have to understand the orchestra caste system of the time. The early orchestras of the 17th and 18th centuries often consisted of two groups of players that played together. First, the concertino. They were usually composers, trained and established musicians, or rich noble patrons of the arts. And second, the ripieno. They were usually lesser musicians, students, or sometimes servants. Most of the solo lines in these orchestras were given to the concertino. Composers like Vivaldi, Corelli, and Bieber were often part of this concertino. Meanwhile, the ripieno would only get to play the tutti parts when the whole orchestra played together. Granted, in the days of early orchestras, violas were often used as 3 or 4 middle lines in the orchestra and often given a single concertino line, but most violas were part of the ripieno and therefore not elevated to the high status of the concertino. Viola was considered a servant's instrument, without the glory of the cello or the violin. It is interesting, though, violas were very popular. This was in part because of their range and mellow tone in comparison with violins. The Baroque violas, because of their gut strings, short fingerboards, and lack of modern shoulder or chin rests, were hard to play and just didn't project at a volume loud enough to be heard as well as the violins and cellos of the day. Many composers wrote famous pieces for the viola. Telemann's Viola Concerto gives the viola a full concerto. Bach's Brandenburg No. 6 features violas as solo instruments. Mozart's Duo Concertante for viola and violin, which is essentially a double concerto, and Beethoven's I-Class Obbligato for cello and viola, both have the viola as the top solo line. And so the viola actually got some time to be heard. During this time, the viola had a couple of instrument cousins that could almost be considered anachronistic by today's standards. The two most well-known of these are the viola d'amore. This is a viola with 6 or 7 top strings and 6 or 7 resonant strings. Resonant means that the musicians don't play them. They ring out while they play the other strings, and add a sort of early reverb to the viola, much like a sitar. Leopold Mozart, that's Mozart's father, said of the viola d'amore, "It is best played in the evening, but suffers itself to have to be retuned consistently." Quite a daunting task to need to retune 14 strings, especially when 7 of them would be made out of gut and no fine tuners were used at the time. The other viola cousin is the beefy violoncello da spalla. The da spalla is a chin cello, usually with 5 strings. Many music historians believe that Bach's famous cello suites, especially the 6th suite, were originally written for this instrument and not the full-size cello that they are played on today. In the late 18th and 19th century, the era of giant orchestras and towering composers, the lowly Baroque viola was rebuilt and upgraded with a taller bridge, higher string angle for more tension, longer fingerboard, and a bigger body. This allowed it to project and become an essential part of orchestra repertoire of the time. But it wasn't until virtuosic players like Lionel Curtis, William Primrose, Rebecca Clark, and Paul Hindemith pushed the viola envelope in the early 20th century that the viola really took its place on center stage along with the other instruments of its family as a respected solo instrument. And at that time, many, if not all major composers, Bartók, Bridge, Britten, Shostakovich, Walton, and others became passionate enough to create the modern viola repertoire and make the viola the powerhouse of an instrument that we know today.